the level of shambles is unbelievable on a normal day of the week. And the caliber of the thinking is unbelievably poor. One of the things, the ANC's lost a lot of things that it needs to govern. It need money, electricity, other things, voters, all of them being lost. One of the things it's lost is intellectual depth and the ability. I said somewhere recently that these guys cannot think their way out of this problem anymore.
My name is Dawie Roodt. I'm the Chief Economist at the Efficient Group, and you are watching WorldView. At WorldView, we explore everybody's perspective on all things that can broaden, well, our worldview. And somebody certainly that will contribute a lot in our worldview and our perspective on the world is Dr. Frans Cronje. He's the outgoing CEO of the Institute of Race Relations and a director at the Center for Risk Analysis. And may I add, also a very good friend, somebody that I have huge respect for, and I think somebody with proper insights in the South African society, in South African politics, and certainly in the South African economy as well. Frans, wonderful talking to you.
Hello, Dawie. It's great to see you. And I feel the same way about you.
Thank you, Frans. All right, let's get going. The last, perhaps let's just step back a moment, for just understand the context a little bit and what's been happening internationally, perhaps, and what's been happening internationally. Forgive me for giving the context, but internationally, most economies have been doing quite well, especially in recent months after their various lockdowns. The South African economy also a little bit out of the blocks at least, but not nearly as well as most other economies in the world. But if you could step back a little bit more and look at the South African economy for the past 10 years or so, then what is clear is that the South African economy is in very, very deep trouble. My reason that I would give for the main reason for where we find ourselves today is because of the mismanagement of the South African economy, and that simply has to do, or primarily has to do, with the ANC-led government. So where we find ourselves today is that for the most of the past 10 years, on a per capita basis, we've been getting poorer. Unemployment levels are at record high levels. The state finances are totally unsustainable. And now this. Is that more or less a correct summary of where we find ourselves, Frans?
Yeah, I think so. We had a first decade as a democracy, and on the scoreboard, by the end of that, things were looking better. The government debt levels have been cut in half. The number of people who had a job was double what it had been in '94, just less than that. Living standards had risen very quickly. The intensity of violence and protest action in the country had calmed down. We were calming down. Our murder rate was actually cut in half in the first decade. Service delivery, better than many people gave the government credit for. And the soundbite we've used 1,000 times is that in that first decade, 10 formal houses were being built for every shack that was newly erected in the country. There was a budget surplus. That was an amazing thing. And there was a budget surplus, and next to it, the rollout of what became the most expansive social welfare program of any emerging market. The economy between 2004 and 2007 was growing at 5%. It's over 4 years on average, which is the first time that had happened for 4 years since the 1960s. So yeah, first decade, I suppose, Dawie, if you'd put this to someone in the 1980s and said, well, there'll be an election, there'll be a new administration, and a decade in, we'll have a budget surplus, twice as many people with jobs, half the murder rate, they would have said, you're very optimistic.
Yeah.
So that was one decade. Was it sustainable? Another question. Then there was a second decade, the one that really started after 2008. A few things have gone on. One is that Thabo Mbeki has been removed. and he's removed in a putsch that's really put together by the left of the ANC, which resents what they saw as his Washington consensus, fiscally conservative economics. When Mbeki goes, you lose a lot more than the man. You lose what had really started or really got moving quickly in 1992 at Davos, where Mandela made a speech. Now, Mandela goes to Davos. He's just been released from prison. And Davos is I've never been, but I hear the great and the good go there. And they go to hear this man who will surely become South Africa's leader, and to hear what he's going to say. And what they're actually there for is he going to say, nationalize the commanding heights, and it's going to be a banana republic like many post-colonial African societies, or do you get something else? And in the interim, something has happened. Mandela has had rewritten the economic paragraphs of the speech drafted for him by his party colleagues, fresh from decades of Soviet exile. And the speech is quite pragmatic. And in early ANC policy thinking, you pick up very interesting little lines, such as that social development must be financed through growth and not through borrowing. You get this sort of fiscal conservative streak. Our read later, my colleagues, some of them disagree. My read, and I think the bulk of the colleagues, is that Mandela and Mbeki, Mandela's brilliant and ruthless, realized that the Nats have made such a mess that if you don't grow quickly, the IMF will be in the game by the end of the 1990s, and then your budget speech gets dictated from Washington, and that's the end of your revolution. So there was this relatively good period. The political payoff for the ANC, and this is never reflected on, particularly by the critics of the party, is that by 2004, the party is 6 percentage points stronger, 7 almost, than when Mandela had led it to freedom. So you're fiscally conservative, life's getting better, the country's calming down, still got a long way to go, but politically you're more popular. Ideological resentment in the main of that sees Mbeki defeated, and everything that came after Davos in 92 is gone, and the clock gets turned all the way back, probably to something significant like the ANC's policy conference at Morogoro in Tanzania, 1969 or 68. And that's dogmatic Soviet state planning, centrally directed command economy dogma. And we begin to do it in South Africa, dogma. At the same time, governance is collapsing because Zuma's main interest is sort of building up some sort of fiefdom. He leaves policy to his left-wing backers. He's not a left-winger, but the two interests have come together to remove Mbeki. And so governance is collapsing. We're becoming very crooked. We were already very crooked. Now we're becoming very crooked. Policy is becoming very hostile to investment, and we drive that thing straight through the global financial crisis. And there was no looking back from that point on. And
so, let me interrupt you here. Okay, so it was the end of the Mbeki era, and I pick up two things that you're saying here. The one is that there's the new president, Zuma. He's not interested in ideology. He's only interested in creating a kind of a fiefdom for himself. But in a weird kind of way, the ideologues, he found himself in bed with the ideologues as well. So there are two driving forces here. The one is let's call it the criminal driving force. And the other one is it's an ideological driving force that both took over the ANC. Is that more or less correct?
Yeah, they both take over. Zuma is the criminal driving force, but it's not taking over. I mean, the arms deal that happened under Mbeki and Mandela already. Don't forget the Eskom's lights were already going off before Mbeki vacated. There's in fact a great theory that Zuma saves Mbeki because what Mbeki had built was fundamentally unsustainable because of the harm that affirmative action is causing to the civil service and BE is causing to investment. And just as he's at his zenith, Zuma pips him and removes him. And so it can now be written that South Africa was flying until Zuma came along. They're all turned. Then we had corruption. And the analysts that say this stuff to their clients, I've heard it, that when Zuma came, load shedding started. And Zuma introduced corruption. Now that's crap, because that was all already on the go. But Zuma does arrive. He is, however, the least ideological leader the ANC has had. But
still, you know, I've debated this specific point with some of your colleagues in the Institute, Anthea Jeffrey, for instance, and that is that, yes, I believe there's an ideological driving force behind all of this, but I think that is much less significant than what people is trying to give it credit for. I think basically the ANC is just one massive patronage, and a lot of people are just there for the taking, and not really because they are interested in a national democratic revolution as such. Sure, there are guys like Rob Davies and Pravin Gordhan that are real ideologues, but it's mostly just one massive criminal organization. What would you say to that?
No, I disagree with you. It is that now, it's criminal enterprise, but I don't think you can easily unscramble the egg between the criminal enterprise and the ideology. Now, there are proper ideologues in the sort of mold of Britain's Arthur Scargill, who are hardline ideologues and know their stuff. And that, sort of Rob Davies or so on would qualify. But what's important is the zeitgeist of the place, the faith that's deeply imprinted inside its political DNA, a view of the world. I first saw it as a relatively new analyst long ago, when I'd go and talk about growth, and there'd be sort of an ANC audience, and I'd say, you know, that if you grow the economy at 5%, we do that for 10 years, we'll become terribly rich. We do it for 12 or 13 years, we'll double size of GDP.
Yeah.
And there were people who said to me, no, that's not true. Growth can't do that. It's impossible. It's a trick. Redistribution can achieve that. And what that was, I mean, it's a lamentable lack of understanding of economics that I understand a little bit of now, largely because of our host this evening. But what it was too was that deep ideological undercurrent. And you mustn't see that only in a proper sort of blue-blooded communist who can quote the stuff at you. It's the belief system that the private sector is fundamentally hostile and harmful to the poor, that investment brings, I mean, I remember years ago in 702, when this stuff started becoming more prominent, there was a 702 radio program on whether we should pursue economic growth, because if we did, it could create inequality. And you know, you think like, oh my God, no, it can't be. But that's the ideology. So ideology is very important.
Yeah.
Very
All right.
important.
Okay, but there we have it now. So Zuma took over, and it happened before that, you're absolutely right, but the past 10 years was a complete, total and disaster for South Africa at all levels. The local authorities collapsed, the state-owned enterprises collapsed operationally, financially. The fiscal accounts became completely and totally unsustainable. We have rising levels of unemployment. We have people going to bed hungry. So the economic conditions deteriorated dramatically. Now, I'm sure you listened to the other Mbeki, and where his point basically is that it was economic conditions that led to this uprising. So, but then we have the conditions. It was certainly a condition of hardship and of poverty and everything that goes with that. Before I'll let you answer that and see what your comment is, because essentially my question is, what started all these riots? Was it economics or was it politics? I just want to make the comment here, and that is that South Africa is it's an artificial political entity that was put together by the Brits in 1910, and South Africa is not a natural country, if you like. But this whole thing is kept together politically because you have rather few people that do most of the tax paying and a lot of people on the receiving end. This whole thing, this balance between the taxpayers and people on the receiving end keeps this entity called South Africa politically intact. But that thing is starting coming Right? And slowly that is falling apart. And I mentioned the fiscal accounts, and I'm very concerned about South Africa's political future. But that's a side note, and maybe we can touch on that a little bit later. But we have the socioeconomic conditions that was really not very nice to be a poor person in South Africa. And then we had Zuma going to jail. And maybe just before I let you take it from there, Zuma was not put in jail by the police. Zuma was basically, the police was basically forced at the 11th hour, pretty much in reality, to take him to court, because otherwise the Minister of Finance or the Minister of Police would have found himself in contempt of court. The same with all these other things. The Zondo Commission, the institutions in South Africa that are actually successful. It was the press that kept on reporting about the corruption and incompetence and everything that goes with that. But then we have it. So what was this unrest that we saw recently? Was it political? Was it economical? And eventually I want to get to discuss what's going to happen next. But what started this whole thing?
Well, we've been measuring things. So I'll tell you what we see, and then you can decide what that tells you. In the first decade we spoke of, where things got better, we saw the level of violent protest come down and the level of support for the ANC go up. Now, I'm quite a simple guy, so I once had an actuary explain to me why that doesn't work, but I think it does. And then we started to look at the second decade. And you know that today, when Thabo Mbeki left, I think there were 14.5 million people with a job. Now there are, I think, 14.9 million people with a job. A real per capita GDP, you mentioned earlier, falling for the better part of a decade. So life's starting to become worse. The rate of increase in social grants slows down and the number of new grants added, and the grants increase at an amount that's ever less competitive with inflation, as poor people experience inflation, because they experience much higher inflation than rich people, because they spend more of their meager income on high inflationary items. Now, as we saw life, the proportion of families in a shack starts to go up in recent years. As we saw that happen, we saw support for the ANC go down. And it's now 12 percentage points lower than the peak to which Mbeki had taken it. We also saw the number of violent protest actions go up by 400% in about the 12 or 13 years to now. And the intensity of protest, now that's the proportion of all protests that are violent, went up from 10% to 30%. So what I think happens, I'm not a terribly complicated person, is that as life got harder, people got fed up with the government. Support for the ANC fell, protest levels increased, and the intensity of protest increased as well. On the basis of that, we write a note on a Monday morning to firms that subscribe to it and individuals. And in that note, I asked the analysts that write it with me to go back. In the last 18 months, we warned on 7 occasions that there was to be an explosion of anarchic violence and looting in the country. Now, we didn't know that because we had uncovered the plot. We'll talk later about this plot that has undone the new dawn, Dawie, you must know, and the recovery we were so firmly on. We just saw the trend lines. We saw the initial 2 million jobs lost because of the lockdown. Households absolutely crushed as a consequence. Confidence indicators falling through the floor. The authoritarian nature of the lockdown had also put a lid on protest action for 18 months. Now, the police commissioner today, in a former the police minister, when he was the commissioner, said a very stupid thing. Long ago, he said, we will no longer tolerate all this protest. Put an end to it. It makes us look like a banana republic. And we thought at the time, this is a very foolish man, because protest action is a pressure release valve. It's a good thing, the protests. Gets people it's when we were asked years ago when North Africa blew up, if South Africa would do the same. I mean, the region, the Arab Spring or winter, as the Israelis of course, more astutely called it. The Americans saw a spring, the Israelis saw a winter. It tells you a lot about understanding the world. And we said, no, there won't be, because South Africa is a fundamentally free society. You can express your frustration. You can write a letter to Business Day. If you're very critical of the Institute of Race Relations, you can write a letter and say it's terrible what's going on there. And if you're poor and angry, you can protest. It's a good thing. So we saw those trends. We saw the steep socio-economic hammering that was caused to people because of the lockdown, because we copied the Western lockdown without the ability to provide stimulus. I mean, it's a blindingly stupid thing to do. And of course, it's going to crush living standards at the end of this tough decade. So we thought it was pending, and it blew up. What about the plot? There was a plot, an insurrection, an attempt at a coup. All protest action is plotted, I suppose we're going to call it that. I mean, you'd get your mates together and say, I'm fed up now. And you'd perhaps tell your neighbors to join, send messages and start a WhatsApp group and print a poster and say, bring down the mayor of Boksburg or whatever it is. We already see very high levels of violent protest, as I've shown you already, with destruction of property. I mean, you ask sort of factory owners of the sort of eastern flanks of Johannesburg what they've been through in the past. The truck burning at Moy River is not a new phenomenon. Things happen a lot. So we had this crushing economic effect. Then we had the usual planning of protest action that we get, and things blew up. There's a story, well, the cell phone masts were all disabled. Cell phone batteries, I forgot the number. I wanted to look it up for you. The number of cell phone masts that are looted for their batteries on a normal month of the year. It's an astonishing figure, just like the truck burnings. It's amazing. So I think we just had a very tough economics that created the predictable reaction. And of course, in the midst of that, there were people who saw the advantage in it and rallied it along a little bit and incited. All of that's true. So I don't think this was a coup attempt. But there are people in the country who know how to plan coups, and they were trained by the East Germans. They're very good at such things. And I said in a note this morning, the Monday morning note, that I think a coup is now a potential event, because the revolutionary potential in the scale of the violence in Natal, I think, won't be lost on people that could actually pull this off. And if we maintain very high levels of poverty in this country and living standards decline further, we anticipate the protest trend lifting, and then it becomes very easy to incite things. So, I think it's mainly, if you push me, I never like to unscramble eggs.
Yeah.
It's mainly the economics. And Mbeki, he's right, Moletsi, the brother. And he said another thing that's right. He said that Ramaphosa played up this coup thing to frighten, he said, the whites, I think, with the image of bloodthirsty Zulu savages bearing down on them. Therefore, they need to double down on their support for Ramaphosa to save them from the fate of things and the institutional memory of Lord Chelmsford's experiences in Natal have lost in that community.
Yeah, I must tell you also, and I think I mentioned this to you perhaps, is that, as you know, I'd analyzed the fiscal accounts, and the fiscal accounts are simply unsustainable. And Tito Mboweni was trying to stabilize the fiscal accounts, and that simply means that you need to spend less money. And one of the biggest expense item is spending money on people. And there are 21 million people receiving an income from the state every month. Every month, 21 million of them. And two items that the Minister of Finance was planning to cut in his last budget are the wage bill on civil servants, and there are approximately 2 million of them, and then also the various grants on the 90 million grant recipients. Basically, that means that there's a guarantee. There's a guarantee whether the Minister of Finance plans to do this or not, because of the state of the fiscal accounts, there is a guarantee that 21 million people, their income in real terms will fall. So I'm not even talking about the unemployed masses out there and the poverty out there. Even people with an income, 21 million of them receiving an income from the state, their income will fall. And I did make the prediction that this will add to social tension in South Africa. And I believe that is also a contributing reason to what we've seen. Additionally, keep in mind, the president just announced that another nearly 10 million people will also get grants until the 2nd of February next year. So that means that the total number of people receiving from grants from the state on a monthly basis, an income of some sorts, is what's a 30 million people now. I mean, that's 50% of the population, given an income from the state every month. And then in 7 months' time, we're going to take away that 350 Rand per month. And the other guys that are still getting money from the state, they will still be getting less. Now, so my next question to you is that I have very little doubt that this underlying tension in the country, the social economic tension, will remain. So where are they going to go next? Is it going to be to the warehouses? Is it going to be to the cell phone towers? Is it going to be to the factories or only an N1 at Moy Plaza? Or is it potentially going to be, and you did mention it can potentially be in the form of a coup, but where's the next one going to be? Because I am pretty sure there's going to be a next one.
Yeah, look, there are ones all the time. We're now calming down, but we're calming down to an exceptionally high level of violent protest action in any event. So we're a bit like the coronavirus pandemic of protest, and except that our troughs show very high levels of infection, and our vaccine, which would be growth, isn't available because it's not around. You describe the checkmate, Dawie, and you do it well, and this is why you're the best economist out there. So many economists I've sat through with on this, and they look at the Treasury and the budget projection, and they say, well, look, they're going to cap the debt, and they're going to keep it there, and they're going to cut this and that. And we've suggested that you don't understand the political consequences. What that means is you will reduce the living standards of 30, 40, 50% of people in the country in the run-up to an election that you can lose. We'll talk about that too. But the government persisted in this austerity drive, and it's crazy and stuff. And we have an austerity policy in order to address a budget crisis brought about by hostile policy to investment. And that's not, I mean, there's a lot of wastage and corruption and looting and that. But austerity, it is impossible. If the ANC tries this, it will blow up on them. It now has. What happens next is you're going to see a lot of very high intensity protest actions, as you do all the time. Now and again, there will be sparks that detonate big ones. And the big ones will follow the patterns that we started seeing long ago when Mbeki was still around. So it's not, I mean, that nice, neat Mbeki, and it was wonderful, and then Zuma, it was terrible. It doesn't really work. The pattern of the xenophobic riots and violence. When we first saw the first big one and we started trying to understand what it was, and we looked at all the numbers and things, one thing that's always seems to be around is high food price inflation, which now just, you know, if you sit in one of those very high towers in Sandton where you survey the world, I feel at the end of my institute career, you can say things that you're so far removed from the ground that you've lost touch completely. When food price inflation is high, what happens is a chap who tries to eke out a living on the minimum wage, or something desperate, actually goes home and has to tell his family, you're not going to get this month what I could bring you last month because it's too expensive. And those kids will look at him, Dawie, you've got children, and they'll say, you know, well, they want this or they're hungry. And what must he do, that guy? And he's the working chap. I mean, he's the chap with a job. millions of young people trying to look after their families and kids without even a reliable source of income, and then you increase a price of an item, of course you're going to get an explosion. If you now exacerbate that by cutting the income in real terms, whether it's through cutting state wages, civil service, or social grants, or even the merry-go-round of tenders and BEE that is really welfare for the well-off. That's sort of what BEE has become, a welfare program for the quite rich. Consequences, you send someone home. Many people, thousands, tens, then hundreds of thousands, who face their families and they can't look after them. Now, what emotions go through a person in that? And you do this year in and year out, and it gets worse year after year. And your response is to build an even bigger welfare program financed by an ever more under pressure budget. It's just stupid, actually. And one day we'll have the very big eruption. Now, I must answer, what is that? I still think politics, like water, finds the line of least resistance. You know, if you've got a flat roof, and it always will leak, because water will find its way. You can do anything you want. Water will come into your house. And politics finds the line of least resistance. As long as we remain a free and open society in the main, I think the inflection point is going to be an election. And what's going to happen sooner than one realizes is on the big screen at that results center of the IEC, you're going to see the ANC and its little flag, and next to it, the number's going to be 40-something. And it's finished. And it doesn't have a majority anymore. That's South Africa's inflection point. From then, we'll build a coalition of parties who struggle to keep themselves together when it's just their own party. Try and put 10 of them together to govern the country where one couldn't decide what to do. Will be a complete shambles. The best case from here on out is that in the midst of the shambles, someone or a few people put a couple of billion rand behind, because it will be that, a serious opposition political options. The Democratic Alliance is in much better shape than it was a few years ago. It's now a clear alternative, which it wasn't then, and therefore it really was a non-starter. Now it is. Or in supported by the DA, a political sort of black conservative movement, almost in the model of Mbeki's budget surplus. When people say he wasn't a conservative, you can say budget surplus, and then he becomes a conservative, undoubtedly. And so you'll get the ANC will lose. There'll be a coalition with complete shambles, but at the moment it's complete shambles too. Out of that, serious money gets put behind serious opposition parties, and then with support of the DA, it's now much better off, get a national majority and go back to the era of gear. That's option one. That's the best case.
Yeah.
By the 2030s, we're doing super well. The second case is that if this hesitancy about supporting clear blue water opposition, so clear distinction remains. You know, people feel it's politically incorrect to say that you support a sensible option, or that you think that race-based empowerment has been destructive to investment, which it has been. If that remains the case and we don't get such an option, what then happens is the fragmentation of the union. South Africa is 110 years old. It's very young. The full 110 years have been a disaster from the get-go. There have only been in that era 15, 92 to 2016 years, 2007, when the country was well governed to the advantage of all its people. It's an artificial construct. The idea that you can govern it out of Pretoria, it's been tried now by a few administrations. They've been the opposite of each other. They've tried a mishmash of policies. It's ended badly every time. The way fragmentation of the union works is not Ian Smith charging off to say declaration of independence. It's a de facto independence. Slowly, the state's authority recedes as it runs out of money. It just becomes less effective at doing what the state should do. Security is one thing. It's the definition of the modern state, a monopoly on the use of violence. It's long gone. It didn't take these protests to show that. I mean, these militias guarding the road with their shotguns that they previously used for duck shooting did more good than the efforts of the commander-in-chief and the security forces. And it will be healthcare, it already is. It will be education, it already is. It will be service delivery, to fill your own pothole. No one's coming to fill it for you. And what happens is you build enclaves in seas of turmoil. And an enclave is a community that has a collective mindset. And the mindset is no one's coming to help. And we're going to make the best of it. And they could build quite effective enclaves. The potential, you'll know more of cryptocurrencies and things there might be great. I still don't completely understand, but I think my colleagues tell me it's good. But already, Dawie, the rich have dollarized themselves. They've left the rand. They've gone to a more serious currency, although one that I also think has trouble on the horizon. Yeah. And inside these enclaves, you have a stockade and a community that exists under terrible circumstances. They'll be like little spots on a map, like leopard spots across the country. If you live in a community that cannot get its act together to fill your own potholes and not whine about it, it's unfair, I know. I'll get the letters tomorrow from the readers. It's unfair. I do know that, and I do know you still pay tax, and it does suck, but it's where we're at now. Communities that build their own institutions could become quite robust, and some of them could become really exciting little economies all on their own. Beyond that, and they've got to hold out, long enough to survive whatever blowback there will be from the defeat of the ANC. I used to say that I think when the ANC goes, it just kind of goes away because it's too useless to put up a fight. I don't know if that was right. I now think it might put up a hell of a fight. And your enclave must be strong enough to survive the 10 or 15 years that might take. When you again open the gates of and draw the drawbridge down and come out and look at the world around you, which is a bit overly dramatic, but it does make the point. The enclave have been a blessing to the country because it means that we'll have retained pockets of the skills and the capital and the expertise to build again. No one has ever been through this kind of mayhem of insurrection and blow-up while being able to retain their middle class. The middle class always became a diaspora. The enclave phenomenon is something we're a cutting-edge example of already, and was something I think might become a global phenomenon. The breakup of the state, because we don't need the state anymore. We escaped a state of anarchy as man to develop a state that had the authority to govern us, and we granted it the monopoly on the use of violence. There was no better way to escape the state of anarchy. Now there is. You can actually build a small, substantive, independent community and make a go of it. And I think that is, if you say to me, and then I'll stop. If you say to me, which one is it going to be? I think it's going to be the enclaves, Dawie.
Yeah. Frans, yes, I've been thinking about this, and I must tell you, we simply do not have time. Do we have enough time to wait for a political event, for an election defeat of the ANC? I think that is another couple of years perhaps away, not that far away. And I think things are going to go really seriously wrong economically before that happens. But allow me to come back. I know you have some serious contacts everywhere in South Africa. But you mentioned earlier in our discussion about a new dawn, and this was truly the end of the new dawn. If there ever was an end to the new dawn, this was the end of the new dawn. And I think the ANC government was humiliated in public for the rest of the world to see. I mean, imagine the private sector providing the police with ammunition. Imagine the private sector, in many instances, defending what the state is supposed to be doing. You refer to the monopoly of violence. Essentially, that is what the state is. I want to know, there was a complete failure of intelligence, obviously. There was a complete failure of operational capacity of the police. We can all see that. There's no way you can get away from that. But I want to know, did the president and his cabinet discuss it behind closed doors? And what did they say to one another? Did somebody shout at somebody and say, "You useless, incompetent buffoon," for example? What happened behind closed doors?
I don't know, Dawie. The level of shambles is unbelievable on a normal day of the week, and the caliber of the thinking is unbelievably poor. One of the things, the ANC's lost a lot of things that it needs to govern. It need money, electricity, other things, voters, all of them being lost. One of the things it's lost is intellectual depth and the ability. I said somewhere recently that these guys cannot think their way out of this problem anymore. So the ability to do so isn't there. So I don't know who shouted at whom or if anyone did, but the shambolic nature of the response, the chaos of the police, the not knowing where they were. I'm here talk now of the army begging for diesel because they can't go any further, run out of food. It sounds like the invasion of Lesotho a few years ago. We talk about in our team. My successor is a brilliant chap called John Andrews, and John is a fan of the theory of punctuated equilibrium. What it appears to mean is this: that for an era, a society is frozen in place by certain paradigms and institutions, and now and again, probably when its government begins to lose control, there's a great thawing and the freeze is broken, the ice age ends, and everyone is now animated. So you can reorder the society, you can base it on new rules, new paradigms, new power brokers, the whole business. And that happens for a short time before the next ice age comes and it freezes it in place. And the punctuated equilibrium, the way John and I envisage it, is South Africa was sort of here and it carries on, but it's fundamentally unsustainable. So the police and intelligence can't function properly because they're so racked with cadre deployment and affirmative action that they don't actually have anyone able to do the job. Then the consequences of that see the country take a steep dive. We hit a new equilibrium. And then we continue along this one. And then we hit the next one. So you come down in these kinds of steps. And what happened now, I think, was one of those steps. There was a time, we never really bought into it, that there was thinking that the ANC would hit one of these moments, like when Eskom really had a lot of blackouts, and when jobs weren't created and growth didn't happen, and this would shock it into reform. And I did have one or two insights into some of those moments. One was the ANC's near loss of Gauteng in an election. And Dawie, there was zero introspection about the reasons for this. There was just making peace with the new status quo and carrying on. And that has been my experience without exception, that every time South Africa took a major step down, there was no lesson learned. There was no sense of introspection or doing things better or differently. There was no trigger for profound reform. There was a reluctant acceptance that it's gone wrong and there's really not much we can do about it.
But Frans, you have to admit, or at least that is part of the current narrative, is that some of the bad guys are, well, Zuma is in jail, the MK has been disbanded, Ace is on his way out, a couple of other guys are in trouble. I mean, the bad guys, we're chucking out the bad guys. Ramaphosa is busy consolidating his power. Just give him some time. He will start doing the right thing.
The people trained in East Germany are not only those who can plan coups, more importantly are the people who can create messages in the media. You've been asked to believe, if you watch things, you've been asked for a number of years. You were asked to believe that the Zuma era would end and give rise to a new dawn. Good name there, very clever name. You were then told that even once, Mr. Ramaphosa had beaten Mr. Zuma, it couldn't quite happen then. You had to wait 18 months because there'd be an election. And at that election, he needed to get a mandate threshold. This is another clever word. This isn't a sort of word thought up by an ordinary person. And a mandate threshold meant that he had to get 60% of the vote. And therefore, you had to vote for Cyril. You can't vote for Cyril. You can only vote for a very corrupt political party. And it was crap the whole way. I mean, why did he need a mandate threshold? He was the president, ANC had a majority, could introduce any labor or investment policy reform it chose. Straightforward. Then after the mandate threshold, you came and you voted for Cyril if you did that. We won't ask for a show of hands. Then you're told, no, it can't happen now. Now it has to be the long game. He needs to consolidate his position. So, all right, he can appoint the right people to arrest the right people if he chooses to, but we'll have the long game. Then the long game became a very long game. And the strategic brilliance of the long game, we're asked to believe, is that it coincided with deeper deficits than had been recorded at really only 3 occasions. And since the establishment of the union, growth was disappointing and we weren't creating any jobs. But we just had to bear with it. Just at the moment when it becomes totally unbelievable, even for the most firm Cyril Ramaphosa guy, you get told, no, there's been a coup. And the coup has undone all this reform. The ANC will dine out on this coup story for a decade. There's a prediction. Every time it's asked why it didn't create any jobs, they'll say, do you remember the coup? It was we were on the cusp of the long game, delivering finally via the mandate threshold the new dawn and the rebirth. And then there was a coup.
Okay.
We couldn't do
Frans, come on.
If reform is easy, I mean, this is the point, and you also make this. Reform is easy. You need a political majority, and you introduce policies that make it easier to employ people and for poor people to get into the labor market. You take away all the obstacles to investment, starting with expropriation. You take away the taxes on investment in the form of BEE and the like. You'll do terribly well. And we know this because of what I said about the first decade, when in the main, and of course it wasn't perfect, that's what happened, and the political results were there to see. The reason that you're being asked to believe in all these new dawn mandate threshold terminologies is that there is no reform and there's none coming. And the reason is that Mr. Ramaphosa is not a reformer and his government's not reformist in the main. And they're going to double down on bad policy until the political effects make it impossible for them to continue further, which is this fork in the road between either the defeat or this formation of the enclaves and the breakup of the union.
Frans, I'm looking for straws now. So let me try another one then. What happened to South African Airways was not Minister of State and Enterprise Pravin Gordhan putting South African Airways in business rescue. It was a trade union forcing him to do that. The reason why the Zondo Commission was instituted the first time by Zuma, quite ironically, was because the press basically forced him to do that. The reason why Zuma is behind bars today is because the judiciary, in the form of the Zondo Commission, this is irony, basically forced the police to do their work. And there are many other examples of the institutions in South Africa actually doing the work of government. It's not the politicians taking the right decisions. It's not them doing what they're supposed to be doing. And just by the way, whenever they do the right thing, I mean, it's the front pages of the newspapers. At least we've got a politician doing the right thing because it happens so infrequently. But the point I wanted to make here is that we still have some institutions. Some of these institutions will save us. If it's not Ramaphosa, at least the institutions will force him to do the right things.
Institutions are important, and they are the reason why I can tell you that there is a possibility that the end game here will be an election defeat for the ANC. And if that happens, it will be because, on the whole, the institutions held up under pressure. And this isn't a profound insight or anything. I mean, we became a democracy for one reason, that if we ever reached a point where the country wasn't well governed and the people weren't happy, for the first time, they'd have the ability to go and change who was in charge. So our end game is simply to say that, well, maybe that will happen. Now, we have polls and all sorts of things that show us it's already happened. Question is your question. Do the institutions hold up long enough for it to happen? If that fails and the institutions break down, and I've never been a great institution person, I think the constitutional order is only as robust as the willingness of the strongest party in a society to accept its limitations, the limitations on their power. They can't do more than that. If that order doesn't hold and the enclaves happen, what that in practice means is the state has surrendered its monopoly on the use of violence, not to institutions and democracy, but to new power players who are simply stronger than the state is.
Yeah.
So you might make it practical for people. You might get a peri-urban community where a taxi association, which has now done a stellar job of maintaining law and order, decides after this, you know what, we're not giving that power back. And that association now becomes an enterprise that is the most powerful deal broker in that community. It maintains law and order and the allocation of resources, really the two functions of the state now. And becomes corrupt itself in the end. And perhaps you might have a community where the taxi industry and, I don't know, some other industries also powerful come together. And they said, listen, we've got a joint interest here. We want to run businesses that are successful and stable, and we want our homes protected, and you guys want your business to work. So we'll make a deal. We'll work together. The state comes third in the deal. Those kinds of societies will become the enclaves. They're not very democratic. And the weakest partners, sort of the poor and the desperate, are very vulnerable. I mean, they're already vulnerable in this society. So if the institutions don't hold, you go to enclaves, because enclaves are that the constitutional order has been surrendered to new parties who are stronger and more powerful than the state is. If it holds, we go to an election, and the election result is effectively accepted. And that's where the institutions become important. Now, but I said to you earlier, I think the institutions aren't, the institutions are very vulnerable. You know, if you deny foreign funding to civil society, not my group, incidentally, we were almost, and I'd say now, we've just fired our last foreign contributor because they were interfering. We're probably now 100% South African finance, but completely unique in the civil society world. If you do something such as, I think the Russians and others have tried to say you can't be a foreign finance group, a lot of civil society disappears. The media is very vulnerable, both on the South African government and on China. And the South African government's got the radio monopoly. China's got a hold on Naspers through Tencent, and it's got the stake in Independent. So there's not a great deal left. And the judges held the line this time, and that was good. I don't think they're always wonderful, and I think they're too infused with the spirit of critical race ideas and the like, and that could be very dangerous in the future. But in Zimbabwe, you know, the judges also initially held the line until a mob walked into the court and said, no, enough, and turfed out the judge. Now, Natal didn't end very far from that point. And next time, if it's a properly planned attempt at interfering in the constitutional order, with the institutional memory that we now have, not just of this, but of decades of protest action in the country, then I think the institutions could be snuffed out very, very fast. And then it's an enclave world.
Yeah, I must tell you one thing that's still something that you keep on, one of the straws that you are grabbing at is the institution called the democracy, and whether the ruling party will allow it to lose at an election. But that, of course, is another topic. Frans, I really want to thank you, and I want to, you and I, we've been having many debates for many years. I must tell you, you've analyzed the South African political environment and the economic environment and landscape. You've had a number of scenarios always. I've learned a tremendous lot from you. Your insights is absolutely amazing. You've done amazing work at the Institute and at the Center for Risk Analysis. So thank you very much for that. I'm also a member of the Institute of Race Relations, and I know there are absolutely wonderful people, and you're leaving behind a very capable group at the Institute that I'm sure will continue with this absolute sterling job that you've done while you were there. And I'm sure we will have many more debates like this, and I'm looking forward to our next debate or our next braai, where we can discuss political and economic developments in South Africa, which is always a highlight for me to talk about these sort of things with you. So thank you very much for the last couple of years, and thank you very much for joining me tonight here at WorldView.
No, Dawie, thank you very much. It's a very great pleasure. The Institute is a team, fairly large one, of amazing people. And I had the advantage of cherry picking some of the best ideas they produced. And they are very capably led. And I have no doubt that they're about just now short of a decade to go to the centenary. And I have no doubt that they're going to do exceptionally well in the run-up to that point, and as ever, have a profoundly important influence on the evolution of the country at another perilous moment. Thank you for your kind words. It's a great pleasure. Thank you to the people who watch the things that we produce and say. And yeah, I hope that we will talk often. I'm sure.
Frans Cronje, the outgoing CEO of the Institute of Race Relations. My name is Dawie Roodt. I'm the chief economist at the Fishing Group. You've been watching WorldView. at WorldView, we explore everybody's perspective on all things that can broaden our worldview. And I'm pretty sure that our view on South Africa was broadened by Dr. Frans Cronje. Dankie Frans.
Dankie Dawie.